You know how World War II was won? The factories, the tanks, the sheer flood of American production. But that's the story of how the war was fought. Almost nobody tells you what the war did to money itself. Because the most destructive event in human history somehow ended the Great Depression, minted the American middle class, and left one of the victorious nations so financially ruined it was still paying the bill in the 21st century. This isn't the story of who won the war. It's the story of who won the peace and who went bankrupt getting there. If that's your kind of history, subscribe. This is War Economics. Start in 1939, because here's a fact that should stop you cold. When war broke out in Europe, the United States was still stuck in the Great Depression. 10 years after the 1929 crash, after a decade of the New Deal, the American economy was still on its knees, unemployment running in the double digits, industry limping, millions still out of work. All the government programs, all the public works, all the reform, and it hadn't broken the Depression. And then, in the space of about 3 years, the thing vanished. Unemployment fell from around 9.5% in 1940 to under 2% by 1943. That is effectively full employment, reached almost overnight. The American economy, dead in the water for a decade, roared to life. And what brought it back was not a clever economic policy. It was the war. Government spending on the war effort did in 3 years what a decade of the New Deal could not. This raises an uncomfortable question that economists still argue about today. Was it really peacetime reform that could have ended the Depression, or did it take the most enormous burst of government spending in history, spending to build weapons, to finally do it? Whatever the answer, the timing is undeniable. America didn't spend its way out of the Depression building schools and bridges. It spent its way out building bombers. Hold on to that, because it sets up the real puzzle. All that spending had to come from somewhere, and the way America chose to pay for this war was the exact opposite of how it fights wars today. It's the choice that quietly built the prosperity of the next 30 years. Because to fund a war on this scale, the government reached into the pockets of ordinary Americans in ways that had never been done before. Take taxes. Before the war, income tax was something mostly the wealthy paid. Around 4 million Americans filed. By 1945, that number had exploded to 43 million. The income tax went, in a few short years, from an elite obligation to a fact of life for almost every working adult. The top tax rate was pushed to a staggering 94% on the highest incomes. And in 1943, the government introduced something you still live with every single time you get paid: automatic withholding, taking the tax straight out of your paycheck before you ever saw the money. That system, the backbone of modern taxation, was invented to pay for this war. But taxes were only part of it. The government also asked citizens to lend it their money through war bonds. And this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because it reveals a completely different philosophy of how to fight a war. There were 8 nationwide bond drives, wrapped in patriotism, sold by movie stars and sports leagues and door-to-door volunteers. By the end, around 85 million Americans had bought war bonds, out of a total population of just 131 million. Let that sink in. Roughly half of everyone in the entire country, including children, had put their own money into financing the war. They raised about $186 billion this way. Now here's the clever part that most people miss. Those bonds paid a deliberately low rate of return. As an investment, they weren't especially generous. So why push them so hard? Because the bonds did 2 jobs at once. Yes, they raised money. But just as importantly, they pulled cash out of people's hands and locked it away. Think about the wartime economy. Factories had stopped making cars, appliances, and consumer goods. Everything was being made for the war, and much of what remained was rationed. So Americans were earning good wartime wages, but had very little to spend them on. If all that money had chased the few goods available, prices would have exploded into runaway inflation. War bonds soaked up that excess cash, and rationing and strict government price controls held the line on what was left. The government wasn't just borrowing money, it was deliberately freezing the nation's spending power to stop the economy from overheating. Quick pause, this is exactly what this channel is built for, the money machinery underneath the history everyone thinks they know. If that's your thing, subscribing genuinely helps the next one get made. Now the mountain of debt all this created, and the almost magical way America made it disappear. Because even with all those taxes and all those bonds, it wasn't enough. Total war never is. The rest came from borrowing on a colossal scale, and the national debt did something unprecedented. In 1941, it stood at around $49 billion. By 1945, it had rocketed to $259 billion. Measured against the size of the economy, the debt peaked at roughly 119% of everything the country produced in a year, the highest level of debt in all of American history, a record that would stand for the better part of a century. America came out of the war victorious, a superpower, holding the atomic bomb and buried under more debt than it had ever carried, before or since. So here's the puzzle I promised you. How do you escape a debt bigger than your entire economy without going bankrupt? And the answer is the secret at the heart of America's post-war golden age. The United States did not pay that debt off. Not really. Instead, it did something far cleverer. It grew out of it and quietly inflated it away. The post-war economy boomed so powerfully and grew so fast for so long that the fixed pile of old war debt shrank in comparison every single year. A steady drip of mild inflation slowly ate away at the real value of what was owed. The debt didn't get repaid so much as it got outrun. By letting a giant, fast-growing economy run for a couple of decades, that terrifying mountain of 1945 debt melted down into something completely manageable, without a single default, without ruin. And what fueled that boom is the most beautiful part of the whole story, because it loops straight back to those war bonds. Remember all that spending power the government had frozen? All those wages that Americans couldn't spend during the war locked away in bonds and savings accounts? When the war ended, that dam broke. Millions of families came out of the war with years of pent-up savings and a desperate hunger for all the things they hadn't been able to buy. Cars, homes, refrigerators, washing machines. The factories converted back from tanks to consumer goods, and that tidal wave of saved-up money came flooding out to meet them. It ignited the greatest consumer boom in history. And the government poured fuel on it with one more masterstroke, the GI Bill. As 16 million servicemen came home, the government offered them low-cost home loans and paid for their education, sending a generation to college and into brand-new suburban houses that this cheap credit made possible. Combine it all, the pent-up war savings, the reconversion of industry, the GI Bill, and you get the explosion of the American middle class. The suburbs, the two-car garage, the widely shared prosperity that people now look back on as a golden age. It was, to a remarkable degree, manufactured by the way the war had been financed. A war economy that forced people to save, followed by a peace that let them finally spend. The Depression-era nation that couldn't find work in 1939 became, within a decade, the richest mass society the world had ever seen. But, and this is the twist that reframes the entire war, that prosperity was not shared by the winners. Because there was another nation on the victorious side, a nation that had fought Hitler from the very first day to the very last. And it did not come out of the war rich. It came out of the war destroyed. That nation was Great Britain. Here is the uncomfortable truth the history books tend to skip. Britain won the Second World War and lost almost everything else. By 1945, Britain was effectively bankrupt. Its debt had soared past 200% of its entire economy. Keynes, the great British economist, called the situation a financial Dunkirk. To keep fighting, Britain had spent down its treasure, sold off its vast overseas investments, the assets of empire, liquidated to buy weapons, and borrowed enormous sums. And here's the irony that captures the whole collapse. Some of that borrowing came from its own colonies. Britain ran up huge debts to India, buying supplies and services on credit it promised to repay later. The empire that had ruled and extracted wealth from India for centuries ended the war financially in debt to it. The nation that had entered the century as the world's banker ended the war as one of its biggest debtors, owing money to the very territories it governed. And then it got worse. When the war ended, America abruptly cut off Lend-Lease, the program that had kept Allied supplies flowing almost overnight. Britain, exhausted and broke, suddenly had to pay its own way again, and it couldn't. So in 1946, a British delegation led by a dying Keynes went to Washington expecting a gift, a grant, in recognition of shared sacrifice. They came home instead with a loan, $3.75 billion, to be repaid with interest. Britain, one of the war's great victors, had to borrow from America just to keep the lights on and its people fed. And now the number that says it all. Britain did not finish paying off that loan in the 1950s, or the 60s, or even the 90s. The United Kingdom made its final payment on its World War II debt to the United States on the 29th of December, 2006, 60 years after the war ended. A last wire transfer of about $83 million. Think about that. Children born long after the war grew up, went to school, had children of their own, and Britain was still paying for the war the whole time. The victor was still settling the bill in the age of the Internet. This is the deepest economic legacy of World War II, and it's a transfer of power as much as a war. The conflict didn't just defeat Germany and Japan, it quietly ended the age of European empires and crowned a new one. Britain's financial exhaustion accelerated the collapse of its empire and forced it into decades of austerity. And the crown of global finance, the one Britain had worn for a century, passed permanently across the Atlantic to Washington. America emerged not just as the strongest military power on earth, but as its unrivaled economic center. Out of the Depression into mass prosperity, holding a debt it would simply grow away, while the old imperial powers were left counting their losses for 2 generations. And one last thread worth pulling, because it connects to everything that came after. The way America paid for this war, by asking its citizens to sacrifice, to be taxed, to ration, to lend their savings, was a shared national effort. Half the country bought bonds. Everyone gave something. That is a very different thing from how America would fight its wars later, when citizens were asked to keep shopping while the bill went quietly onto the national credit card. World War II was the last time a great power paid for a great war by asking everyone to pitch in, and, not coincidentally, it produced the most broadly shared prosperity that power ever knew. That's the pattern this whole channel exists to expose. Every war has a second front made of money, and World War II is the one where that front didn't just win the war. It ended a depression, built a middle class, toppled an empire, and quietly decided who would run the world for the next 70 years. If you made it this far, you're exactly who war economics is for. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next ledger.